The rain came in off Puget Sound the way it always did in late October. Not dramatically, not in great sheets that announced themselves, but in a fine, weightless mist that clung to the glass of Meridian Tower like breath on a cold window. From the 40th floor, Seattle looked like a photograph of itself. Soft at the edges, the lights below smearing gold and white against the wet dark. Clara Whitmore stood at the window for exactly 90 seconds before turning back to her desk. She had counted once, early in her career, how many hours she had spent staring out of windows. It was a habit she'd inherited from her father, that particular stillness, the way he'd go quiet in the middle of a sentence and look at something distant as though the real conversation was happening somewhere else. She had trained herself out of it. 90 seconds, no more. Then, back to work. The 40th floor of Meridian Tower was, by any objective measure, one of the most impressive executive suites in the Pacific Northwest. The design firm had used words like aspirational and commanding during the reveal. Pale oak floors, floor-to-ceiling glass on two sides. A conference table that seated 18, cut from a single slab of white marble. And, in the northeast corner, positioned at a slight angle so it caught the morning light when the sky was clear, a Steinway Model D concert, grand black lacquer, 9 feet long, built in Hamburg in 1987. The piano had been here when Clara took over as CEO 4 years ago. Her predecessor, a man named Gerald Foss, who'd retired to Scottsdale and played golf 3 times a week, had apparently believed it conveyed a certain gravitas. He had not played it, neither had anyone else, in any meaningful way. A pianist was hired for the annual gala. Sometimes a client would drift toward it during cocktail hour and press a few keys, a C, a G, a tentative C, again the way people touch sculptures in museums, needing to verify that something beautiful is real. Clara had kept it for one reason, and she had never said this to anyone. It had been her father's favorite piece of furniture in the world. The idea of it. A Steinway D, he used to say, is not an instrument. It is a room inside a room. It changes the air. He had never owned one. He had played on a rented upright in the garage of their house in Bellevue, teaching lessons to neighborhood children, until his hands began to shake at 61, and he had to stop. She had sat beside him once on that upright bench, when she was perhaps 12, and asked him if he was sad that he'd never made it, never played in a real hall, never had a real career of it. He had looked at her with the particular patience of a parent waiting for a child to arrive at a question's actual shape. "Made what?" he'd said. "You know what I mean." He had thought about it. His hands were still on the keys, and he had played one note, just one, a low G, and let it decay until the room was quiet again. "I play music," he said, "because it puts me in a room that has no ceiling. The job, the hall, the name on the program, those are just addresses. They are not the room." She had been 12, and she had nodded and had not understood. She had understood completely for 30 years. The rule was simple. No one touched the piano. It was not posted anywhere. It did not need to be. You understood it the moment you understood Clara Whitmore. She was still at her desk at 9:47 on that Friday night when she heard it. Not the sound itself, not yet. First, the bench. The small, specific creak of the adjustable bench being lowered. The mechanism's soft complaint. Clara lifted her eyes from her screen. Through the open doorway of her office, she could see the northeast corner of the main suite. The overhead lights had been dimmed to their cleaning hour setting, warm and low. 40%. A man in a gray maintenance uniform sat at the Steinway. His back was to her. His posture was not what she expected. He was not perched at the edge of the bench the way people sit when they are about to do something they know they should not. He sat fully, weight settled. Shoulders dropped slightly in that particular way that serious pianists carry themselves, not slouched, not stiff, but released. His hands were resting in his lap. He was looking at the keys. Clara stood up from her desk without making a decision to do so. She walked through the doorway, across 20 feet of pale oak, and stopped. The man heard her. She could tell by the slight shift in his shoulders, awareness, not guilt. He did not turn around immediately. He looked at the keys for one more moment, and then he turned. He was around 40, she guessed. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had spent time outside, good years and hard years both leaving their traces. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, and they held hers without apology and without pretense. "I'm sorry," he said. He began to rise. "Sit down," Clara said. He stopped. She looked at him. The cleaning cart was parked neatly by the elevator bank, exactly as it should be. Everything about the man was neat. In fact, the uniform clean. The shoes without the usual scuff marks of someone who'd been on his feet since 4 in the afternoon. "What's your name?" "Daniel Hayes." "How long have you been on this floor?" "Mr. Hayes." 6 weeks. I transferred from the tower on 5th. She looked at the piano. She looked at him. Something in the composition of the scene, the man, the instrument, the particular quality of his silence made her want to know if she was right about what she thought she was seeing, whether she was projecting, whether this was just a man who'd been curious and gotten caught. "Play Bach," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came from somewhere older than the 40th floor, older than the rule. From the same place that counted seconds at windows. His expression did not change. He held her gaze for a moment, not measuring her, exactly, but settling something internally, and then he turned back to the piano. The first note fell into the room like a stone into still water. She knew the piece in the first 4 bars. Partita no. Due pollice C minor. BWV 826. The Sinfonia, the opening movement. The one her father had called the most honest music ever written, which she had never understood as a child and understood completely now. Daniel Hayes did not play it as a man performing for someone who had demanded a performance. He played it as a man who had been holding something for a long time, and was, for a few minutes, allowed to set it down. The technique was not conservatory polished. There were small imprecisions in the ornaments, a touch more pedal than a purist would choose. But the phrasing was absolutely certain. Every pause was placed with intention. The sound he drew from the Hamburg Steinway was darker and more serious than the room deserved. Clara did not move. Through the glass wall of the suite, she could see 2 of her senior staff, Marcus Webb from Legal and Diane Forsyth from Investor Relations, both working late, both now standing completely still at their respective desks, heads slightly turned, listening to something they could not account for. The Sinfonia was 4.5 minutes long. When Daniel finished, he lifted his hands from the keys and rested them in his lap again, in the same position as before, and he waited. Clara looked at the back of his head. She was aware of something happening in her chest that she recognized, distantly, the way you recognize a language you haven't spoken in 20 years. "Finish it," she said. He turned slightly, a question in the angle of his head. "The partita," she said. "Finish it." He turned back to the piano. He played for another 22 minutes. When it was over, he stood up without theatrics, adjusted the bench back to its original height with 2 practiced clicks, and moved to retrieve his cart. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said. She said nothing. She was looking at the piano. She stood there for a long time after the elevator doors had closed. Clara did not sleep well that night. She lay in her apartment on Capitol Hill with the city lights making pale shapes on the ceiling and listened to something she couldn't name. She got up at 5:15 and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with a blank notepad. She had always thought through problems this way, writing the thing out, even if she never looked at it again. The physical act of putting pen to paper, a way of externalizing what was tangled. She wrote one word. Why? Then she put the pen down. She knew why. That was the problem. Daniel Hayes lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Central District, 14 blocks from a bus line that took 40 minutes to reach Meridian Tower on a good day, 55 on a bad one. The apartment was on the third floor of a building that had good bones and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests within a week, which Daniel had decided was better than average. The walls were white. There were drawings taped to the refrigerator. His daughter's name was Emily. She was 7 years old, with her mother's brown eyes and her father's habit of going very still when she was thinking hard about something. She had been asleep when Daniel came home at 11:30, her arm around a stuffed elephant named Gerald, who had lost one eye the previous spring and been given a button replacement that was the wrong shade of brown. Daniel stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, before going to the kitchen to eat the dinner he'd covered with foil before his shift. Cold rice, leftover chicken, sliced cucumber. He ate standing at the counter because the table was covered in Emily's drawings. She was going through a phase of drawing horses, all of them with disproportionately large heads and expressions of philosophical gravity. In the corner of the small living room, against the wall under the window, there was a Casio keyboard 61 keys, slightly smaller than full size, with a stand that had been repaired with epoxy where one leg had cracked. Emily's music teacher at school, a warm and patient woman named Mrs. Reeves, had told Daniel 3 months ago that his daughter had a good ear and natural rhythm and would benefit from lessons if the family was in a position to consider it. Daniel was not in a position to consider it. He had given Emily what he could. The Casio, 30 minutes a day, himself. He sat beside her on the bench on the weekends and showed her things. Not formally, he wasn't a teacher, but he could give her the architecture of it, the way music was built, which notes wanted to follow which other notes, and why. He showed her that a mistake wasn't a stop sign, only a detour. He showed her that the space between notes was as real as the notes themselves. "You're playing too carefully," he told her one evening, when she'd stumbled on a passage for the 3rd time and gone red with frustration. "Because I keep making the wrong notes," she said. "The wrong notes aren't the problem," he said. "The problem is you're so afraid of them that you're holding your breath. The music can tell." She looked at him skeptically, the way 7-year-olds look at adults who say things that sound like wisdom. "Play it again," he said. "Make as many mistakes as you want. Just don't stop." She played it again. She made 4 mistakes. She didn't stop. "Better," he said. "I made more mistakes." "I know," he said. "But they were honest ones." She did not ask HR. That felt wrong. A surveillance of some kind. An application of institutional force to something that should stay quiet. Instead, she called Marcus Webb on Saturday morning and asked him to pull the contractor file for the building's cleaning service without making it a thing. Marcus, who had worked for Clara for 3 years and understood the particular tone in which she said, without making it a thing, did not make it a thing. Daniel Elliott Hayes, 41 years old, employed by Cascade Facilities Management for 2 years. Previously, a paralegal firm in Tacoma, a warehouse in Renton, and before that, this was the part that made Clara set the file down on her kitchen table and look at it for a long moment. The Thornwood Conservatory, where he had been enrolled in the graduate performance program for 1 year before withdrawing. There was no note explaining the withdrawal. She thought about the way he had sat down at the piano, the way he'd adjusted the bench without looking muscle memory, the body's quiet record of 1,000 hours at an instrument, the phrasing of the sinfonia, certain and a little bit grieving. She called Marcus back. "Is there anything in there about family status? It's a contractor file, not a personnel file." "There's an emergency contact, Emily Hayes, listed as dependent." "His daughter," Clara said. "Presumably." She thanked him and ended the call and sat for a while longer. She was not a sentimental woman. She had gotten where she was by being clear about what things were and what they weren't, by resisting the narrative impulse that turned coincidence into meaning and strangers into symbols. She knew this about herself and considered it a strength, but she kept thinking about the partita in C minor, and about her father's hands on the upright in the garage, and about the fact that she had not sat down at a piano in 11 years. On Monday, she arrived at 7, which was her usual time. The building was quiet at 7, the cleaning crews had finished at 6. The day staff didn't filter in until 8:30, and Clara liked the particular quality of those 90 minutes when the office was entirely hers. She walked to the Steinway. She sat down on the bench. She placed her hands on the keys. Nothing came. She sat for 5 minutes. Then she stood up, adjusted the bench out of habit, then stopped when she realized she was doing what he had done and walked to her office. She had a 9 o'clock with the board's risk committee. She prepared for it with her usual precision. She intercepted Daniel Hayes on Wednesday evening, at the end of his shift. She had thought about how to do this and decided the only honest way was directly. She was waiting in the lobby when he came down with his cart at 10:50, and she watched him process the fact of her presence there with the same measured quality she'd noticed before. No performance of surprise, just the internal adjustment of a person who has learned to meet unexpected things calmly. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I looked at your file," she said. She'd decided to begin there, with the thing that might embarrass her, because anything else would have been a kind of bad faith. "Thornwood Conservatory. You were there for a year." He set the brake on the cart. "Yes. Why did you leave?" The lobby was empty, except for the overnight security guard at the far desk, who had the discretion to be looking at his monitor. Rain on the glass doors. The same rain. "My wife was sick," Daniel said. "I came home." Clara looked at him. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." Not dismissive, simply factual. He had the manner of a man who had done the work of grief and was on the other side of it, though he carried it still. "Your daughter," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression, not wariness, exactly, but the sharpening of a parent's attention. "I'd like to offer her use of the piano," Clara said. "The Steinway, upstairs. After building hours, say 9 to 10 on Tuesdays and Thursdays." There'd be no one up there. He was quiet for a moment. Why? It was exactly the right question to ask, and she appreciated that he asked it. "Because it's a good piano," she said, "and because it's not being used." He looked at her steadily. She held the look. "I'd have to think about it," he said. "Of course." He released the brake on the cart. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she said, and was immediately uncertain why. He nodded once, and the gesture was respectful without being deferential, and he pushed the cart toward the service corridor, and she watched him go. He called the facilities management office the next morning and left a message that Miss Whitmore could tell his daughter yes. Clara received this secondhand through Marcus, who reported it with careful neutrality, which meant he had questions and was choosing not to ask them. "Clear my Tuesday at 9, she said. "And Thursday? Both evenings?" He wrote it down. Emily Hayes arrived on the first Tuesday, wearing her good coat, dark blue wool, slightly too big in the shoulders, clearly bought with room to grow, and an expression of elaborate calm that Clara recognized immediately as the face a child makes when they are trying very hard not to show how much something means to them. Daniel held his daughter's hand in the elevator. He had arranged with his supervisor to start his shift at 10 that evening, and he stood now in the main suite of the 40th floor and watched Emily walk across the pale oak floor toward the Steinway, with the focused gravity of someone approaching something sacred. Clara stood near the window. She had not planned to be here, or she had told herself she hadn't planned to be here, but she was here. Emily stopped in front of the piano and looked at it for a long moment. "It's bigger than it looks on the internet," she said. Daniel almost smiled. "Sit down, Em." She sat. She placed her hands on the keys with the careful positioning of a child who had been taught to position them correctly, and was doing so with great deliberateness. She looked at her father. "What should I play?" "Whatever you've been working on." She had been working on a simplified arrangement of Für Elise, the kind found in beginner books, stripped of its ornaments, the melody clear and manageable. She began to play. She was good. Not prodigious, not a story about a child who sat down at a concert grand and produced sound that stopped time. But she was genuinely good. Her sense of rhythm was natural, her touch sensitive, and she listened to herself, which was rarer than people understood. She stumbled on the transition to the minor section. Stopped, started again, stumbled again. "Don't stop," Daniel said from where he stood. She played through the stumble, accommodating it, finding her way back to the melody. Clara had been watching from a distance. She crossed the room, not quickly, not with announcement, and sat in one of the chairs near the piano, angled where she could see Emily's hands. After Emily finished, she looked at Clara. "Can I ask you something?" Emily said. "Yes," Clara said. "Why do you have a piano if you don't play it?" The question landed in the room with the simple weight of a child's directness. Clara looked at the keyboard. "That's a fair question," she said. "I used to play. A long time ago. What happened? I stopped." Emily considered this. "Did you forget how?" "I don't know," Clara said, and the honesty of her own answer surprised her. Emily turned back to the piano. She placed her hands again in their careful position. "Can you show me how to do the part that sounds sad?" In the middle, she played a few bars, the shift into minor, the part she had stumbled on. "It keeps coming out wrong." Clara looked at the keyboard. She looked at Daniel, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. She moved her chair closer to the bench. "Slide over a little," she said. She placed her right hand on the keys. The muscle memory was strange, present and distant at the same time, like a word in a language you learned as a child and haven't spoken since. She played the passage slowly. The shift into the minor section, the way the melody darkened. "You're pressing too hard," she said. "The sad notes don't want to be forced. Let your hand drop into them. Like this." She played it again. "Feel the difference?" Emily tried. It was better. "Again," Clara said. They worked on it for 12 minutes. Clara did not once think about the board's risk committee, or the quarterly projections, or the message from the Shanghai office she had not yet answered. When she finally sat back and looked up, Daniel was watching her with that same unreadable expression. And then his face did something she hadn't expected. Not a smile, exactly, something quieter, something that seemed to come from a place deeper than happiness. He looked, very briefly, like a man who has been worrying about something for a long time and has just been given a reason to worry less. She suggested coffee 3 weeks later, on a Thursday, framing it as a conversation about Emily's progress. She believed, as she said it, that this was true. She rehearsed, on the way to the cafe, 3 specific talking points about the Bartok piece Emily had recently begun. The way her left hand was developing, the question of whether she might benefit from a structured lesson framework. She arrived with these things prepared. She did not use any of them. The place she chose was not anywhere near Meridian Tower. It was a small cafe in the Madrona neighborhood, 12 tables, mismatched chairs, windows that fogged on cold evenings, the kind of place where nobody would know her name and nobody would recognize the green coat she'd worn deliberately for precisely that reason. She arrived first and ordered black coffee and sat at a corner table and looked at the street. He arrived 7 minutes late, which meant he'd taken the bus. He was wearing his own clothes, dark jeans, a flannel shirt in a shade of blue that made his gray eyes look lighter. Without the uniform, he looked both more ordinary and more himself. She noticed this and recognized, without sentiment, that she had been noticing things about him for several weeks. The way he held himself. The way he spoke to Emily, low and level, no performance. The way he watched his daughter play with an expression that was not pride exactly, but something closer to relief, as though Emily at a piano was evidence of something continuing in the world that Daniel Hayes needed to continue. He ordered coffee and sat across from her. They talked about Emily for perhaps 10 minutes, and then they talked about other things. He told her about Thornwood, the year he'd spent there, the particular quality of those months when he had believed that the life he wanted was entirely possible. His teacher there, an older Austrian man named Professor Keller, who had the gift of making you feel that your relationship with music was a private matter between you and something larger than either of you, and that no audience was required. He said I had a natural understanding of the architecture, Daniel said. He turned his coffee cup in both hands. I didn't know what that meant until I stopped. What does it mean? Clara asked. Music is built. Every piece. There are reasons why things go where they go, not rules exactly, but physics. Emotional physics. He paused. When I stopped playing and started listening instead, I could hear it. The reason for every note. The way Bach sets you up for a grief you don't know you're carrying. Clara looked at her coffee. My father used to say that, she said. He played, taught, mostly. He wanted to be a concert pianist. He became a very good teacher in a garage in Bellevue. She smiled slightly. He never had a Steinway D. He always talked about them like they were cathedrals, some particular kind of space. He wasn't wrong. No, she turned her cup. He died 4 years ago, same month I took over Meridian. Daniel said nothing. He didn't produce the social filler that people reached for in those moments, the I'm sorry. That must have been hard. He let the information sit, and she understood that he understood grief in a way that did not require commentary. I stopped playing the year he got sick, she said. I told myself it was time, that I had to choose. The company was in trouble when I took over, and there isn't time for everything. That's not why you stopped, he said. Gently, not a challenge. She looked at him. Is it? He said. The rain was doing its quiet thing against the fogged window. Somewhere behind them, an espresso machine gasped and hissed. No, she said. He nodded once, picked up his coffee. She thought, he doesn't need me to explain it, and realized she was grateful for that in a way she hadn't anticipated being grateful for anything. It was Marcus who raised it with her, which meant others had been discussing it and he had drawn the short straw. He came into her office on a Thursday morning, closed the door behind him, and stood in the careful way he stood when he had something to say that he'd rehearsed. There's some talk, he said, about Mr. Hayes and his daughter using the piano. She looked at him. What kind of talk? The usual kind, he said. Questions about optics, whether it's appropriate. Given the dynamic. What dynamic, specifically? He held her gaze steadily, which was something she appreciated about Marcus. You spending time with a member of the facilities staff. I see. Diane mentioned it to Kaplan. Kaplan mentioned it to Forsyth. I thought you should know. Thank you, Marcus. He went to the door, stopped. For what it's worth, he said, I think it's good for the floor. The piano being used. The building has been, I don't know how to say this without it sounding silly. Say it. More alive. Since she started coming. He looked slightly embarrassed. Tuesdays and Thursdays, people stay a bit later. Just to hear. He left. Clara looked at the window. 90 seconds, she thought. She picked up her phone. The recital idea came from Mrs. Reeves, Emily's school music teacher, who had noticed the change in her student over the past month. A new confidence, a willingness to play through uncertainty rather than stopping. She had suggested, through Daniel, a small, informal performance. The school's winter music evening, 4 weeks away. 30 families in a gymnasium, children ranging from beginners to the fairly accomplished. Emily wants to do it, Daniel told her. On a Thursday evening while Emily was working on a new piece, a Bartók folk song, simple and clean. She said that? She said, I want to, but I'm scared. He paused, which in Emily language means yes. Clara watched Emily's hands on the keys. What piece? The Bartók. She's been working on it. Clara turned it over. Then she should do it. She called Daniel 2 days later on a Saturday afternoon. She did not have a professional reason to call him. She called because she had been thinking about what Marcus had said appropriate, given the dynamic, and had decided she was tired of the category of appropriate. She had spent her entire adult life doing the appropriate thing, and she was 42 years old, and she had not sat down at a piano in 11 years, and she did not know the names of her building's cleaning staff, and she had a Steinway D that had been a beautiful silence for 4 years. "I want Emily to play at the recital," she said. "I want you to let her." "I wasn't going to stop her," he said. "You were thinking about it." Pause. "Yes. Don't teach her to play safe," Clara said. She had said this before, weeks ago, in a different context, and it had meant something different then. Now she meant it about both of them. He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. 10 days before the recital, Emily had a bad practice. It was a Tuesday. Clara arrived at 9 to find Daniel already there. Emily at the piano, with her jaw set in that way it set when she was fighting herself. She had been running the Bartok for 40 minutes, Daniel said quietly, and it was getting worse, not better. Clara sat and listened to one run-through. Emily's hands were tight, the whole body tight, actually. The stiffness of a child bracing for impact. The piece stumbled through its second phrase and fell apart in the third. Emily stopped. She put her hands in her lap. She did not cry, but the skin around her eyes went very bright. "I can't do it," she said. "You can," Daniel said. "I've been doing it wrong for 40 minutes. That's not. I don't want to do the recital." She said it quietly, with the finality of a child who has made a decision and is now presenting it as fact. "I'm not good enough." Daniel looked at Clara. Clara looked at Emily. "Can I tell you something?" Clara said. Emily looked at her with that expression of watchful reserve that children use when they suspect an adult is about to say something unhelpful. "The first time I played in front of people," Clara said, "I was 9. It was a recital, like yours. I practiced for 6 weeks. I knew every note." She paused. "I walked out on the stage and my mind went completely blank. I sat at the piano and I couldn't remember how the piece started." Emily stared at her. "What did you do?" "I sat there for a long time. It felt like forever. It was probably 15 seconds. And then my hands remembered what my brain had forgotten." She held Emily's gaze. "The music is in your hands, Emily. Not your head. Your head is the one that's scared." Emily looked down at her hands. "Play the first phrase," Clara said. "Don't think about the second. Don't think about the recital. Just the first phrase." Emily placed her hands on the keys. She played the first phrase. It came out clean and light, exactly as it was supposed to. "Again," Clara said. She played it again. "Good. Now the second phrase." Same thing. They worked through it section by section for another 40 minutes. By the end, the piece was not perfect. It was not going to be perfect, but it was Emily's. Her rhythm, her breathing, her particular way of leaning slightly forward on the notes she loved. Daniel watched from his usual spot near the window. When Clara finally looked at him, he was looking at his daughter, and his expression was the one she had started to recognize, that particular quality of a parent watching a child become more fully themselves. The board pressure came the week before the recital. It was the kind of corporate conversation that dressed itself in practical language. Optics, consistency, the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. The board's chair, a man named Gordon Tillman, who wore excellent suits and had never in Clara's memory said anything that surprised her, met with her on a Wednesday morning and spoke carefully about perceptions. "No one is suggesting anything inappropriate," he said, in a tone that suggested exactly that. "But Meridian's leadership culture has always been distinguished," Clara said. "We think of it as rigorous." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. After he left, she stood at the window. She had not meant to stand there. It was the reflex of someone who needed to think without a surface, without the desk and the phone and the stack of things that required response. Below, Seattle was its usual overcast self. The Sound, a pale gray smear in the middle distance. A ferry was moving across it, very slowly, white against gray. She thought about what it had cost her to be rigorous. The particular arithmetic of a life organized entirely around what was prudent. She had been the first woman to lead Meridian. She had been told, in various ways and by various people over the years, that this required her to be twice as careful, twice as contained, twice as correct. She had accepted this framing without fully examining it, the way you accept the terms of a contract when you want the job badly enough. She had wanted the job badly enough. She had been rigorous for 11 years, and she had a Steinway D that had been a beautiful silence, and she had not sat down at a piano in 11 years. And her father was dead, and she had never told him that she understood, finally, what he meant about a room inside a room. She was aware of a familiar pull, the clean, cool logic of retreat. The argument was not absurd. She was a CEO, and the optics were complicated, and she had worked for over a decade to build something that now had real weight and real stakes, and none of it needed to be jeopardized over a piano and a 7-year-old and a man she had spoken to perhaps 12 times. She picked up her phone and looked at it. She put it back down. She picked up the pen and the blank notepad. She wrote, "What are you afraid of?" She already knew. She had known for weeks. She went to his apartment on a Sunday evening, 8 days after the bad practice and 4 days before the recital. She had called ahead, which felt like the right thing to do. He buzzed her up. She climbed 3 flights of stairs and knocked. He opened the door. Behind him, the apartment was warm and smelled of something cooking. Emily was at the kitchen table with a library book, the stuffed elephant beside her. She looked up when Clara appeared, registered her presence with evident curiosity, and then returned to her book with the particular diplomacy of a child who has been told adults sometimes need to talk. Daniel moved into the small living room, clearing space on the couch. Clara sat. He sat across from her. She looked at the Casio in the corner, at the drawings on the refrigerator, visible through the kitchen doorway. Horses, mostly, with their philosophical expressions. "The board has concerns about my spending time here," she said. "With your family." He looked at her calmly. "I wanted you to know that." "And?" he said. "And I don't care." She said it plainly, without drama, because it was a plain and undramatic statement. "I spent the last 11 years doing every correct thing in exactly the correct order, and I am." Of the correctness of it, he said nothing. "I didn't come to Thornwood," she said. "I didn't go to any conservatory. I chose the MBA and the trajectory and all the things that seemed like the real life instead of the life I wanted, and I have done very well with that choice, and I have a 40-floor office with a piano no one plays." She hadn't meant to say so much. It came out in a quiet, level voice, which was why she thought it was all right to let it. Daniel leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. "I couldn't have stayed at Thornwood," he said. "Margaret was sick. Emily was too. There wasn't a choice." He paused. "But I've thought about what Professor Keller would say if he knew I'd turned into the man who cleaned the piano instead of played it." He looked up. "He would say I was still in the right relationship with the music, just on the other side of the glass." Clara looked at him. "You weren't choosing between music and everything else," he said. "You were choosing between safe and not safe. That's different." "I know," she said. "The recital Thursday," he said. "Emily needs to know you'll be there. I'll be there." He held her gaze. Something settled between them, not resolved exactly, but acknowledged, which was the more important thing. From the kitchen, Emily's voice. "Is Clara staying for dinner?" Daniel looked at Clara, the ghost of that quiet smile. "Is Clara staying for dinner?" he called back. Clara looked at the Casio in the corner, at the horses on the refrigerator, at the repaired leg of the keyboard stand with its epoxy scar. "Yes," she said. The gymnasium of Jefferson Elementary School was decorated with paper snowflakes and strings of white lights, which gave it the quality of a dream someone had tried to write down before it faded. 31 families filled the folding chairs. Children ranged from 8 to 14, in their good clothes, with the expressions of people facing something that mattered. Clara arrived at 6:40 and sat in the 4th row on the left side, near the aisle. She had not told anyone at Meridian where she was going. She was wearing a dark green coat that she had owned for 6 years, which was the only piece of clothing she owned that she had never once considered in terms of how it read professionally. Daniel was backstage with Emily. Clara had spoken to Emily briefly at the door, the girl in a blue dress, her hair braided. Gerald the elephant left at home because she decided she was too old for that, and then changed her mind, and then finally decided again that she was. "Are you ready?" Clara had asked. "No," Emily said honestly. "Good," Clara said. "Ready is overrated." Emily had looked at her for a moment, and then she'd laughed, which was better than ready. Emily was 7th in the program. The children before her were various degrees of skilled and various degrees of nervous, and the audience received them all with the same generosity. The warmth of 30 families who understood that this room held something that mattered, that the thing being handed back and forth between the small figures at the instrument and the people in the folding chairs was real, even if imperfect. When Emily came out, she walked to the piano with her chin slightly lifted, the posture of someone choosing bravery, one step at a time. She sat down. She adjusted the bench 2 clicks, the same sound as her father's hands on the Hamburg Steinway, and she looked at her hands. Clara held very still. The Bartók folk song began. It was not perfect. The second phrase caught for just a moment, before resolving the same phrase they'd worked on for 3 weeks, the same phrase Emily had stumbled on 10 days ago. But she played through it, the way Daniel had taught her, the way Clara had reinforced. Honest, not cautious. She played with her whole self in it, which is the thing that cannot be taught and can only be allowed. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something true is happening in them. Clara felt her throat close. She recognized the feeling. She had not felt it since the last time she'd heard her father play. In the garage in Bellevue, his hands beginning to shake, the music still entirely certain despite them. She had stood in the doorway and watched and had not gone in, because some part of her knew it was one of the last times, and she had not known how to be in the same room with the last time. She had spent 11 years not being in the same room with last times. Emily finished. She lifted her hands from the keys in the same precise way her father lifted his, and she looked at them, and then she looked at the audience. The gymnasium filled with sound. Clara was already looking away when the tears started, an old reflex, the turning before anyone could see. But there was no one beside her who needed to not see. There was only the room and the sound of it, and Emily at the piano with her chin still lifted. She let herself look back. Afterward, in the corridor outside, Emily found her. The girl still had her stage color on her face, that particular brightness, and she stopped in front of Clara and said, without preamble, "I made a mistake in the second part." "I know," Clara said. "Did it sound bad?" Clara looked at her steadily. It sounded like someone who kept playing. Emily considered this. Then she nodded once, the gesture so familiar from her father that Clara almost said something. Daniel arrived a moment later, his daughter's coat over his arm. He looked at Clara, and his expression did the same thing it had done that first Tuesday evening, that particular quality of a man for whom something has shifted, quietly, in a direction that had seemed unlikely. "Thank you," he said, "for being here. I wouldn't have missed it," Clara said. And this was the truest thing she'd said in a very long time. 2 months later, in January, the Meridian Arts Initiative was formally established, a small foundation under the company's umbrella committed to funding music and arts education for families in King County who could not otherwise access it. The first beneficiaries were selected in February: 12 children, 6 music teachers, 3 after-school programs. The press release described it as a natural extension of Meridian's community values. This was accurate in the narrow sense and completely inadequate in the larger one. The board approved it without the enthusiasm Clara would have liked and without the opposition she had prepared for. Gordon Tillman said it was good for the company's profile. Clara did not correct him. She understood that people needed to find their own reasons for arriving at the right destination, and she had learned to be less invested in the route they took. Mrs. Reeves, Emily's music teacher at Jefferson Elementary, was asked to serve on the initiative's first advisory panel. She accepted with the quiet dignity of someone who has spent years doing important work in rooms that did not consider themselves important, and who knows the difference between recognition and the work itself. She told Clara, at their first meeting, that Emily's playing had changed in ways she couldn't entirely account for technically. "She's not afraid of the notes anymore," she said. "Some children never get there. It's the hardest thing to teach." "You can't teach it," Clara said. "You can only make space for it." Mrs. Reeves looked at her with an expression that suggested she approved. She had begun playing the piano again. Not performing, not for anyone, not yet, and maybe never in any formal sense. But on Monday and Wednesday mornings, in the 40 minutes before the day staff arrived, she sat at the Hamburg Steinway and played. Her hands had not forgotten. The body's record of 1,000 hours did not delete itself just because you walked away. The first morning she had sat down, expecting rust and absence. She had instead found her hands moving into the opening of a piece she had not consciously thought about since she was 23. One of the Bach inventions, the two-part ones, the ones her father had taught her before she was old enough to understand what she was learning. Her hands knew every note. She had pressed her palm flat against the closed lid afterward. Not grief. Exactly. Something more complicated, the feeling of finding something you had thought was lost and understanding. In the finding, how much of its absence had been your own choice. She was working through the Bach partitas. Starting at the beginning. On the last Tuesday of January, Emily and Daniel came up at 9 o'clock, as usual. Emily had a new piece, a simplified Bach minuet. The same composer, a different key. She played it through once, and it was very good, and she knew it was very good, and she had the grace not to be smug about it, which was a quality Clara had noticed in her from the beginning and considered one of the more promising signs. Clara sat beside her on the bench. "Again," she said. "Slower, in the third bar." Emily played it slower. The third bar opened up. "Better. It sounds sad when it's slower," Emily said. "Yes," Clara said. "Is that okay?" "It's more than okay." Clara looked at the keys. Bach wrote sad music to put somewhere real, so people who were carrying it didn't have to carry it alone. Emily thought about this for a moment. "Like a box? Like a room," Clara said. "A room you can go into." Daniel was at the window, looking at the city below the January dark, the lights blurring in the mist, the same rain that had been falling the night he'd sat down at this piano and changed the air. He had not gone back to Thornwood. That particular door had been open for a specific season, and that season was over. And he had made his peace with that the way you make peace with the shape your life has actually taken versus the shape you had imagined for it. The peace was real. It had cost something, and it was real. But this Emily at the piano, her left hand growing steadier week by week, the way she had begun to close her eyes on the notes she loved, this was not consolation. This was something else. This was the room his teacher had described. No ceiling, no address. He turned and looked at them. His daughter and this woman who had walked through a door that had been there all along, waiting for someone to stop being afraid of it. Emily played the minuet again, from the beginning. The room held the sound. Outside, Seattle went quietly about its life in the dark and the rain. No one inside needed it to be anything other than what it was.